Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Frontline Club. We are still waiting for one of our speakers tonight, Jonathan Steele from The Guardian, but we will begin on time as always. Before I hand you over to Paddy O'Connell, who will be chairing tonight's debate, if I can ask you to switch your phones to silent, and when it comes to questions, if you can wait for the microphone because we are broadcasting live. Over to Paddy.
Millie, thank you. Thank you for a great topic with the right title and the best panel. And it's just worth saying at the beginning that all events at the Frontline Club start late, except this one. So it's true we are starting on time, but none of the other events here do start on time. So we're starting without one of the speakers. It's a town hall style meeting. We quickly come to you. And if you've paid £12.50, I hope you do get your comments in early. I suggest we stick to a structure, which I'll get to in just a moment, the structure. So we are meeting as the world's leaders around the table are in Sweden. So if you do have your access to news, please update us, because on the panel we're not. And if there are things being said, please introduce them from the floor. Please don't turn off your mobiles. Please keep them on. And then also, of course, we're meeting as Obama's used this language tonight. He's changed the red line from being an American red line to being your red line. He said tonight it's the world's red line about chemical weapons. It was agreed after the war. So he's tried to change what he said. So it'd be very interesting to see what you say. Putin has said any action without further proof is an aggressive move. That's today. And that's why we're all in the room. We want to begin with the Ian Panel report from the BBC, which suggests the use of a phosphorus shell. He said at the time it might be napalm. And there's a doctor in there from Britain who's travelled who says, wake up, West, it's now or never. And we don't want you all to agree with it, but we want to play all 4 minutes of it to put us in the mood of what the title of the talk is, Crossing the Red Lines. If you've seen it before, here it is again. And if you haven't, it's 4 minutes long. And it is our title in television terms.
The following report contains some disturbing images.
An old blanket to cover a corpse. There's no dignity in death in Syria. What happened here almost defies words. The end of the school day, a playground full of teenagers, and an incendiary bomb that killed over 10 pupils and left many more writhing in agony. We met the man who took this video, we saw the victims, and we visited the scene. The headmaster doesn't want to be identified, but he explained what happened.
This was the most horrific thing. We've seen images on TV, we've heard many stories, but we've never seen anything like this before. The worst thing in life is watching someone die right in front of you, and you can't do anything. There were dead people, people burning and people running away. But where to? Where would they go? It's not safe anywhere. That's the fate of the Syrian people.
Eyewitnesses described seeing a fighter jet flying repeatedly overhead. Apparently, he was looking for targets. Throughout this conflict, gatherings of people outside have consistently been bombed. Outside bakeries, markets, hospitals, and schools. The air is still thick with the smell of whatever liquid, whatever chemical it was that was dropped here. And it's hard to imagine and hard to describe the horrors of what the pilot did that day. They arrived like the walking dead. We don't know for sure what was in the bomb, but the injuries and debris suggest something like napalm or thermite. There were no shrapnel injuries and little blood, just appalling burns. Among the medics here was a British doctor visiting for the charity Hand in Hand.
I need a pause because it's just absolute chaos and carnage here. We've had a massive influx of what looks like serious burns. It seems like it must be some sort of, I'm not really sure, maybe napalm, something similar to that. But obviously, within the chaos of the situation, it's very difficult to know exactly what's going on.
This wasn't a chemical weapon, but a so-called conventional one. banned from being used in civilian areas by many countries. But 15-year-old Ahmed's government hasn't signed that treaty.
Dear United Nations, you're calling peace. You're calling for peace. What kind of peace are you calling for? Don't you see this? Don't you see this? What do you need to see? We're just human beings. We want to live, you know? Isn't it our right to live? Isn't it?
In a basic hospital funded by handouts, the emergency beds were full. Patients slumped to the floor, pleading for help, gasping for water. By sundown, the chaos eased a little, and a brief moment for the British doctor to collect her thoughts.
We feel like some sort of, not even a second-class citizen, like we just don't matter. Like all of these children and all of these people who are being killed and massacred, we don't matter. The whole world has failed our nation. And it's innocent civilians who are paying the price.
Most of the victims had more than 50% burns, which means their chances of survival is less than half. Arguments about chemical weapons don't matter here. What does is just death itself. Ian Pannell, BBC News, in northern Syria.
So let's begin with a section on to intervene or not, and then we'll go on to what form those interventions would take if they went ahead, and would they shift the balance of conflict. So if that's your interest, would you just hold back as we begin with the question, should we intervene or not, based on chemical allegations and the conventional claims made there. Panel, ask you first and then to the audience. Nearest me is Scott Lucas, Professor of American Studies at the University of Birmingham, Editor-in-Chief of EA Worldview. Is the case made for some kind of intervention?
Yes, but it was made quite a long time ago. I should explain, EA Worldview, we started covering Syria on a daily basis in February 2011, just before the start of the mass protests, the uprising, and we continue to do so on a daily basis, and it's to start with the facts first, start with what's happening. So even taking Patty's opening comment about Putin, the misleading label on Putin's statement today was he had warned the West against intervention. In fact, Joanna Perezchuk, who works with me and who is here tonight, went through that interview in Russian and went through the Russian media's coverage of it, and the significance was that Putin said, if the case for chemical weapons used by the regime had been proven, then Russia might back military intervention. That is a step back from the Russian position. But it's not just a case of reading what's happening in Moscow or Washington or Tehran, it's reading what's on the ground. So to answer your question, Patty, very quickly, one, the facts. 80,000 dead conservatively, 2 million refugees, 4.5 million displaced, near certain, I'm actually convinced of it, that there was a chemical weapons attack with sarin or a similar substance that killed at least 1,360 people on August 21st. 2, there will be no political resolution of this crisis. None. It will not happen until one side is so weak that it capitulates. 3, there are multiple oppositions. You need to realize that, but 4, there are myths about that opposition. Just as it is a myth that the Iranians are fighting on the ground in large numbers alongside Syrian troops, so it is a myth that al-Qaeda-linked groups are dominating the insurgency. Finally, what is peripheral, what is central? What is peripheral right now is that debate in Washington, which is happening with the U.S. Congress, which goes round and round and round. What is central is what happens on the ground, the insurgency versus the Assad regime. And it is not just the Americans you look at. If you want to look at a foreign actor, look at the Saudis, who are providing the weaponry for the insurgency.
We don't want the whole evening. We just need your general view.
No, Patty, the reason why I put it out there, and I know it takes time, is before jumping into saying yes or no, facts, deal it down. A year ago, and I'll say it bluntly, I favored a no-fly zone, a protected area for areas in which the insurgency and the opposition had established themselves, some similarities to the Libyan position that was taken. It should have been done then.
Right.
It should be done now.
Right. Thank you very much. And I will come back to let you flesh these out. But let's just try and limit your remarks to, Lena Sinjab, BBC correspondent in Syria until a few months ago, born in Syria. And here we all are talking about your country and bombing it, which we do regularly in the Middle East, don't we? So what is your view? Is the case made for intervention?
Well, I don't think I have a view, but I have the views of the people on the ground. Many people on the ground, especially those who have been affected and have been bombarded and killed on a daily basis, they look at the case of the intervention today that, well, you waited for 100,000 people to be killed, and only when the chemical weapons we matter, only because chemical weapons you want to intervene. We know, that's what the people say, we know that the Americans are not coming because they want to save us or give us our freedom. They know that they're coming only for their own interest of stopping the chemical weapons. But at the same time, they fear that there is no other solution. As you rightly said, there is no political solution that is coming. Russia is blocking any political solution. Russia, many people told me the Russians, if they want to solve this, they could have asked Assad to leave now and save the country another strike. But also they are very fearful of, if the Americans only did a shot across the bow and it was a limited target, then the Assad forces will retaliate big time on the people on the ground. And we are already hearing lots of reports that already with this 2 weeks notice that has been given to Assad before a decision is made, there is a lot of retaliation taking place and a lot of removement of the forces taking place, and many detainees are put in military bases as human shield that we fear for their own safety at the moment.
So it's not a clear-cut yes or no within Syria?
Within the Syrian opposition, they want this intervention. The majority of the opposition want this intervention, mainly people on the ground, because they're suffering from the life that they're living, but they know deep inside that the West is not coming to help them because they believe in freedom for them, but only for their own interests. But there is no other solution that they can favor.
Shiraz Maher is Senior Fellow at the International Centre for the Study of Radicalisation at King's College, London. Is the case made for intervention of some kind?
Yes. To put it very bluntly, I couldn't disagree with a word either of my two fellow colleagues here have said. I think the case for intervention was made many, many months ago. I favoured it as soon as the siege of Homs took place, where Marie Colvin was killed. At that point, it became very clear that for Assad and for the Syrian Baathists, this struggle is an existential one, and it is a zero-sum game. And from that point on, the issue of chemical weapons or of any other type of weaponry really became an irrelevance, because it didn't matter, and it never did, how many they needed to kill. They would kill whatever number it takes, and they will do this, unless we get involved to some extent.
And by whatever means, do you think?
By whatever means. And in fact, there's some very good intelligence floating around, and I know it's unfashionable to quote Western intelligence sources in the post-Iraq environment, but I think there's some credibility to this to say, in fact, Assad may have personally ordered this, but even if he didn't, he's vicariously liable in the way that the opposition aren't for the crimes that some of the opposition are committing. And we're talking, and I will wrap up very quickly, we're talking about some of the misconceptions, you touched on a few of them as well. One of the great misconceptions here, or one of the great unspoken issues on the ground, is the extent to which the Syrian people themselves have been calling for some form of intervention and have been calling for some form of outside help to come into Syria and tip the balance and just to level that playing field. And we could have done this in a number of ways, simply by putting in a buffer zone around northern Syria, a no-fly zone, to remove Assad's ability to do the things he's doing now.
Jonathan Steele, welcome to the room. Sorry to spring this on you. I'm sure you've had many reasons why we're delighted you're here. But the discussion at this stage is intervene or not. The panel have broadly said, those who are allowed a view, yes. Lena Sinjab of the BBC has explained it's not clear-cut within Syria. I'm going to ask the audience, do you want to collect your thoughts, or would you want to answer if the case has been made for some kind of intervention?
No, let's have a bit of audience while I think about it.
So can I ask to call members of the audience who are not convinced about intervention right now? Right, so let me just go round hearing some of these, and starting with, where's the microphone? Would you like to go to the gentleman in the checked, with the green shirt there first? And then next, with the hand up. Let's just hear your views. The hand up. Could you put the microphone with the person with the hand up? And then we'll go around. Yes, sir, would you like to say your name?
Hi, Marwan from Lebanon.
Hold it here, or none of us are going to hear you at all.
I do apologize. Marwan from Tripoli, Lebanon. I live here in UK. I mean, whatever decision is being going to be made. Recently, a few months ago, I was in Lebanon, and we have massive number of refugees in the north. So whatever intervention or no intervention is going to happen, we should deal with the consequences to whatever is going to happen. And
But are
we
you
should not.
against intervention? Is the question now?
Yes, I guess.
Why?
Because the consequences is going to be massive without the United Nations. I hope everything has to be done through the United Nations.
Are you in favour of intervention backed by the United Nations?
Yes.
And to you next, with the microphone.
Hi, I'm an international relations master's student and also actually Lebanese as well. I got back from Lebanon 2 days ago. I'm against an intervention because I just can't see the logic of bombing for peace. I never have been able to see that logic. I think an intervention is needed, but not with bombs. I think you need to consider where the weapons that Assad has are coming from, the sheer number of weapons someone is supplying him.
Okay, I'll come to you in a moment with the microphone. Shiraz, would you respond?
Wouldn't an intervention stop that? I was just going to ask you. I mean, you're talking about the weapons Assad is getting. Where are they coming from? If we bomb
an intervention needs to come from prevention.
Runway, that would be a good start. We'd
bombing isn't going to stop anything, but perhaps something like an economic sanction, which I know is such an not against Assad. Actually, I actually think against the people that are supplying Assad with weapons.
So who are the people?
I know
who do you think the people are that are supplying Assad?
Well, I mean, there's a large suspicion that a lot of it's coming from Russia, but
right.
So how would you
well, okay, wait. Answer the point. Can you? You don't seem to have a microphone that works. But what the point is that our friend is saying, don't bomb for peace. You're saying bomb for peace.
I'm saying if you take out every runway in Syria capable of handling a shipment coming in from Iran, from Russia, that's going to severely degrade the capability of Assad.
That is a valid point, but that is not the only way to go about it.
Yes.
Can I make the point? I don't think that there is a split in views in Syria. I think people want the intervention, but they are clear about why the intervention is happening. But one more important point, if you don't want to bomb for peace, how can you stop Assad from continuing the bombing? He's using Scud missiles, he's using all sorts of weaponries, and he used the chemical weapons. How can you stop this if there's no intervention?
New question.
Hadi, can I suggest one thing? Can we ask the audience here two questions? Number one, if the United Nations unanimously find out that Assad has used chemical weapons, would they agree for a complete annihilation of the Assad regime? Number two, if they do not accept that they have found any proof of chemical use, then why the hell do we mix up with other people's businesses?
Yes, I'll do that poll. What's your answer to the question? Because I'm trying to marshal everyone's views. Are you in favour of intervention?
Of course I am, if they find that these chemical weapons have been used against the civilians.
They have.
Otherwise, the rebels...
Well, you're waiting for the UN report, are you?
Of course.
Right.
United States cannot be the judge, the jury, and the
Okay, I'll do that poll. Pass the microphone to the gentleman next to you.
My view is that clearly chemical weapons have been used, but it's not completely evident who's done it. The evidence has not been provided by the West. Western intelligence has been pretty poor. They've offered no evidence whatsoever. There's evidence to say that Saudi Arabian shells from actually delivery of the sarin gas. There's reports of rebels being caught with 2 kilograms of sarin gas on the Turkish border.
So are you against intervention right now?
Right now, I'm completely against it because there is no evidence of further...
Right. Okay, that's enough for me. Jonathan Steele, would you react and let the rest of the panel come in and then back to the hall?
Well, I'm very much against military
intervention. Jonathan doesn't see. Can Jonathan have a microphone as well?
No, I've got this thing. Well, does this work? I'm very much against military intervention. I agree with the don't bomb for peace line. I think it would be a disaster. We don't know what the repercussions would be, the consequences. We've had too many interventions in the last 10 years in Iraq and Afghanistan that we were told would be short and quick and surgical and all the rest of it, and they turned out not to be. So we should really learn now the third time not to do it again. That's one thing. Secondly, this is a civil war. We should not be intervening militarily in a civil war. We should be neutral and trying to broker a negotiated ceasefire and peace talks, bringing in the Russians, the Chinese, the Iraqis.
We've been doing that for 2 years. For 2 years we've been trying that.
We had 12 hours of a meeting in Geneva on June the 30th.
Yes, Jonathan's finishing his point.
We had 12 hours of a June the 30th meeting last year in 2012, and unfortunately it was screwed up immediately because Lavrov and Hillary Clinton made rival statements at their concluding press conferences which completely destroyed what they'd apparently agreed.
So miscommunication is what's taking the war
No,
into its third year.
because the United States is still trying to topple Assad. It's not neutral. It's not trying to say let's deal with this.
But the Russians aren't neutral either. You realise this?
They're not neutral either. That is why I say they must get together. And there seemed to be some hope when John Kerry and Lavrov met in May this year, tried to revive Geneva, but it went bankrupt because, unfortunately, then this arming of the rebels came up. The rebels didn't want to go to the talks. The real reason why Geneva hasn't worked is not because Assad is not going to the table.
Right.
It's because the rebels refuse to go because they keep thinking they're going to win with the West coming in on their side.
Okay.
And now it looks as though that is happening.
New point. So, panel, react to what you've heard, starting with you nearest me, Scott, and coming back to you in the room.
2 points. One, deal with facts.
No, can you deal with what we've heard in the room?
No, that's what I'm asking right here. Because you have a charge. You have a very important charge here, which is that the chemical weapons case has not been proven. And the fact is that we have more evidence than we've had on previous occasions through videos, witness statements, through various other forms of collecting information, including from doctors and victims. I know the stories you tell, sir. I've heard the disinformation.
You're talking about chemical weapon attack. You haven't given any proof.
Sir.
That it's actually been done by the Assad regime. That's all.
Sir.
And look, one thing you've said.
Where's the evidence of who did it? Where's the evidence of who did it?
There were dozens of videos. Stop. Are you listening? Please stop. Please stop. Please.
Well, answer his question. Where's the evidence who did it? I'm taking up your point. Where's the evidence who did it? Where's the evidence who did it?
Dozens of videos establish the victims. They establish the locations where the victims were. They establish the hospitals where they were carried out. They established that 7 towns were hit within minutes or hours of each other. They established that hundreds of people died within the first 2 hours. There is no way that the insurgency could have carried out a coordinated attack on 7 locations using big rockets, not homemade rockets, probably Frog 7s or M600 rockets.
Can I just add on this? The locations where these attacks took place are in the suburbs of Damascus, in the eastern Ghouta, and they are all the villages where the rebels are living, and one after the other. And these are all the locations where they're living, their families are living. How can they just bombard their own selves with sarin gas, basically?
Sure.
They're killing their own selves.
And I would just say to you, I don't actually regard the question as a genuine one, because I don't know what standard of evidential proof you would need to get over this hurdle, because actually the evidence is there. Sorry? People are going to die from the chemical weapons.
But people are dying now every single day by the battle.
Easy. Okay, listen. If you ask questions back, I want to give them the microphone. So just in general, can you react to what's come from the room?
I don't regard these questions as being sincere or genuine. When people continuously raise this now, because there is basically what further level of evidential proof do you require to get over this hurdle? I just have one final point. You're talking a lot, Jonathan, about this issue. We should talk to these guys. We should talk diplomacy. This is the same line we heard, and it was very fashionable in the West, pre-Arab Spring, that we should do this with Gaddafi. We'll get him to open up. We should do it with who else? Who was the other guy we were all courting? The idea diplomacy would open them up. Okay, Assad. Who were the 2 most brutal dictators of the Arab Spring? Assad and Gaddafi.
Right, so it's a public meeting, so we're just on the question of intervention or not. To you next, sir.
I want to take issue with the question to intervene or not, because at the moment there are only 2 nations who have actually committed to intervening. One is America, the other is France. Apart from that, everybody else is sitting on the fence. Why are they sitting on the fence? Partly because of international nerves about what might happen if the evidence isn't there. There are 2 nations that are not involved in this discussion. One is Russia and the other is Iran. Yesterday in The Guardian, Shirley Williams made the very, very convincing point that there is the possibility and the window for a dialogue with Iran, who after all are backing a substantial part of the fighting that's going on here, and Russia has suddenly changed its position. There are 2 possibilities of back channel. To intervene now, before that back channel is used, would be disastrous.
Okay, and to you, Jonathan, and panel, would you react?
Well, no, I mean, I agree with you. You must bring Russia into it. Russia is arming one side. The Americans want to start arming the others, and they're already giving logistical support. They are already giving massive logistical support. The point is it's a strategic stalemate. Assad is not winning. He may have made some gains recently, but he's not winning. He will never win. He'll never defeat this insurgency. Vice versa, the insurgency will never topple Assad, as we've seen. He is very brutal. He's very willing to use any kind of weapons if necessary.
Do you agree with
so
this? So
therefore, there has to be a recognition of a stalemate and get the big powers to come in and try and tell their clients to reach an agreement, a compromise.
Yeah. I want to respond to you, sir, and also to Jonathan. Jonathan and I were on the same side before Iraq 2003. We both very strongly opposed the intervention there. I still do. We're on different sides now with respect, Jonathan, because I would like to believe there's a diplomatic possibility. I would like to believe, and in fact, I favor dialogue with the Iranians. I'd like to think there's a back channel there. The problem is that the situation on the ground has gone too far. What will happen in the next 10 days or 2 weeks while the Americans may or maybe not decide to do anything at all is that Assad forces will carry out a series of very violent offensives in the Damascus suburbs, in the north, using heavy bombardment. We're going to. Political solution just isn't going to be on the cards this week.
I'm going to call you, then I'll call people in the room in favour of intervention, then we'll do the poll as we agreed with you. To you, sir, with the microphone, an old friend at the Frontline Club, I believe.
Thank you very much, Paddy. I will support intervention.
Okay, just to stop, you're moving us on because no, you can move us on.
I do not intervene. I do not support intervention for the simple reason
use the microphone.
That I do not know who is going to rule Syria after Assad has disappeared.
Okay.
Are we going to have a situation like Libya or Iraq?
Can you hold that and I'll call you back in our news section. Who is there in the room who'd like to speak in favour of intervention of some kind? The argument has, as you've heard, slightly gone to the floor against. So is there anyone in the audience who'd like to make the case for? And then I'll do the poll I promised and move along.
I think there should be intervention by either the Turks or the Qataris rather than the US. So they should be policing their own backyard. Also, a quick comment on the thing before. It's a lot easier to prove who didn't do it than it is to prove who did. And given there's only two candidates, if you eliminate one, it's fairly easy to work out who's left.
Okay, so I proposed, the gentleman here, is this a case for intervention? Yes, please make it.
Yes.
And with your name, if you like.
Yeah, the name's Ewan Grant. I've worked for many years with law enforcement agencies inside the ex-Soviet countries, so the bit about supply of equipment is very interesting. I would just like to point out the gentleman's point and Professor Lucas.
Use the microphone, Ian.
Please don't confuse, as some people have and as the professor has not, lack of proof as lack of evidence. The professor, I think, demolished that mistake there. I would just like to point out, as an argument cautious for intervention, that regardless of who wins, some very, very nasty people are going to displace out of Syria. So it is not just a question of the danger that we will put AQ-like people in. Even if they lose, they're going to go somewhere else.
Right.
And if Assad loses, some very dodgy characters on his side are going to go too. Let's look and see where the converted Ohio-class submarines with their big stocks of Tomahawks are.
Thank you. Thank you. You can come back later. So we're going to move on in a second to if strikes were to go ahead, would they shift the balance of conflict in Syria? But I promised our friend there that we would do a show of hands, and I promise you the don't know option. And you may not like a poll, and you can not vote at all. So you can have a don't know option. But I'm going to ask you two questions. If you are in favour of some kind of intervention soon, including proof of some kind, I haven't got time to say what kind.
Are you implying military?
Yes, I'm implying a military intervention. Yes.
That's important.
It is important. And are you, this is another old friend here, I'm pleased to say, or are you someone who backs no intervention or intervention a long way down the line? So it's none or a long way off, or it's some soon and a don't know. So some kind of intervention soon. Would you like to show your hands in the air? It's about a third, I believe. None or a long way off. It's sort of the same number, slightly less. And don't know or another indicated a lesser number. So that's a pro-intervention move there. Would you like to react, Jonathan?
Well, I can see why people are very upset by the use of chemical weapons, and it is disgusting. But let's not forget that only about 5% of the people who've been killed in Syria since this started have been killed by chemical weapons. So this sort of moral kind of exaggeration over the chemical weapons thing seems to be a bit artificial. If you wanted to intervene, you should have done it at the beginning. Now it's too late because it has become a proxy war. All kinds of sectarian tensions have emerged, which are inflaming the whole of the Gulf region, particularly Iraq at the moment. And one has to try and calm this down. If we intervene, we are going not because it's no longer punitive because of chemical weapons. It is regime change.
Over to you in the audience.
Clear yesterday.
Yeah, over to you in the audience now.
I agree that chemical weapons shouldn't be the necessary pretext for action, but surely the situation is so dire that some kind of action has to be taken. Why is it okay to just stand back? I disagree that, chemical weapons, red line, but the numbers are staggering. How is it okay that just we stand back and say, oh, no intervention now?
Because we will be making it worse by intervening. We will have ruled out any possibility of negotiation for a year or 2 or 3. As I just said a moment ago, Assad is not going to be defeated militarily very easily. It'll need not just one lot of strikes, it'll need strikes for 6 months, a year, 2 years, and nor is he going to win either. It is a stalemate. We should recognise that.
Thank you, Jonathan. So I'm going to move us on because we heard from our 3 panellists nearest me who have a different view to Jonathan. So I'm not going to go on with this particular part of the evening anymore. I'd like to ask, if strikes took place, would it shift the balance of the conflict? And then I'll come on to neighbours. It's not neighbours now, it's would strikes shift the balance of the conflict? And we'll start, if I may, with you, Scott Lucas, Professor of American Studies at the University of Birmingham. Coming back to you in the room, everyone can speak. Would it shift the conflict?
Limited strikes, considered only as strikes without considering what happens afterwards, will not shift the balance of the conflict. Specifically, what President Obama said is a shot across the bow will not shift the balance against the conflict. The bigger question, because it's a strategic question, not a tactical question, is what strategy do you have for supporting the insurgency? So it is a question of arms supplies. Do you provide anti-aircraft and anti-tank weaponry to the insurgents, which negates the weapons that Assad continues to have to basically maintain some kind of basically dominance? Do you support a no-fly zone or a protected zone in the north or in, for example, the east of the country? In other words, do you support an intervention which has some similarities to the intervention that took place in Libya in 2011, which allowed people to be protected, and the opposition, therefore, could move against Gaddafi?
Many people I spoke to in Damascus and across the country, they have the same fear that if it is a limited intervention, there will be big retaliation against Syria. It will not cripple the regime and force the regime towards going a negotiated settlement and a political solution, as Jonathan was mentioning. And the fear that if no action is taken or no strike is taken, that there won't be any solution. Assad will continue with the killing, and there is no room for political solution. And I don't think that the rebels are the ones who didn't want to go to Geneva. Look at the number of civilians, political, peaceful activists who are inside Syria, even from the minorities, from the Alawite community, that are being locked in prison so that they don't find any political solution. So the only way forward is with a strike that would push the regime to a political solution.
So the question is, could a strike shift the balance of the conflict? A certain sort of strike could. What about going for his family? It's thought the brother Maha might have used the chemical shells. If that's proved, do you just go after him? Do you kill him?
Well, the issue is you need to limit the regime's capabilities of striking again and fighting again. That's what people think on the ground. The decisions are made. It's a family decision. It's not only Assad. Maher is involved and also Bashar. You need to get rid of the whole regime. That's what people want on the ground.
So a strike that just blows up the odd battery of anti-tank missiles or anti-aircraft missiles, they can't hit the chemicals, can they, Shaz? Because that releases the agents within them. So what strike shifts the balance of conflict?
Well, the nature of the strike will determine what happens next, and we've already heard there could be token gestures, there could be something more meaningful. You can actually hit the chemical stockpiles. We have weapons that are developed and designed to take these things out with neutralizing agents within them that would then negate the toxic side effects. I'm not saying it would be clean, I'm not saying it would be perfect, but one must look at the overall balance here of what is taking place in Syria. And to understand, I mean, we're talking, yes, if the West intervenes, we will inevitably, through our intervention, kill indirectly and unintentionally some civilians. But if we stand back, that regime continues to do the same thing every single day. So the nature of our intervention, I think, will determine what happens. I personally would support a no-fly zone with a protected zone, and then you have a situation a bit like Libya where you could actually create a transitional authority within the country. Right now you can't do that in Syria.
Is a strike that kills Assad accidentally a success? If you kill Assad with one of your missiles that you've launched, is that success through accident?
Well, let me speak just for myself here to say I don't think it should be an accident. We should kill him.
Well, I mean, I came late and I apologize for that. Did you say that we'd be talking about legality at any point tonight?
Well, I didn't say it. No.
Well, I mean,
the United States
could I bring in the issue of legality since nobody else seems to have done? I mean, when you say we should intervene, do this, what about the United Nations Security Council? I mean, it's time that the West stopped this unilateral intervention illegally on countries in the Middle East. It's just not. It's just crazy to go on with it. If the United Nations, all 5 Security Council members agreed to it, then that would completely change the complexion, because obviously Russia would stop supplying arms to Syria immediately, and Assad would be in a very difficult position. But as long as Russia is not willing to do that, then you cannot say that anything you do is legal. There's no way that it's going to be legal for the West unilaterally to
I personally believe that our values are far superior to Russia's. So I don't think we need to be too in hock to what the Russians are up to right now.
Right. Okay.
Now you're questioning the Russians.
All right. You can have the microphone again.
A country that openly persecutes homosexuals, I don't think there's many values.
There are new speakers. We'll go to the hall now. We've gone round the whole panel. Do use your name if you like.
I'm Kinder Haddad. I'm half Syrian, half Dutch.
Welcome.
Thank you. I mean, I definitely want Assad to go, and I want this to stop. But every single person I speak to in Syria doesn't want an American intervention, because they fear it's going to be, more civilian deaths, unfortunately, because their intentions are not, wholly honourable. The only thing, what I'm not convinced with all of you, you all totally dismiss the negotiations. And okay, I mean, I don't trust Assad myself either, but it hasn't even been attempted. Every time anybody brings it up, the US and Cameron, they say, oh, no, it's not going to work, it's not going to work. There hasn't been one single meeting. And Assad, like Mr. Steele said, did say yes. Why not call his bluff and, do sort of negotiations? But nobody's even called his bluff.
I think Scott would like to react to that, and we'll go to you next with your hand up.
No, it's very simple. The precondition, which is set by many of the opposition groups, is that Assad has to agree to step down. You know that, and that's where the negotiations. Whether I'm just saying that this is the point that's come into.
But can I interrupt and mention the initiative that Muaz al-Khatib did, who was the president of the coalition? He said we're ready to go for negotiations. He just put like a few conditions, including releasing the women detainees in the prisons of Bashar al-Assad, and that did not meet.
So we're all.
There is no.
All right. So this could.
No, I mean,
we'll return to this.
He was ready to do negotiations,
Yeah, all right.
but
I just want to.
did not respond.
I'm looking at the moment on the question of strikes. If they happened, would they shift the balance of the conflict? Is that what your question's about? Can I ask?
Yes.
Yes. Not. This is microphone's at the back here at the moment.
Oh, hi. Yes. Sophia Taha, just because I didn't give my name before. I just don't understand why there's only 2 options here. Why is it strike or no strike?
Oh, we've done that.
I know that we've done that, but I think it's not covered enough. I appreciate that you want to...
Well, I'll call you again. The question of strikes, would they shift the balance of conflict, is on the agenda tonight. So I'm only just going through the agenda. I'll call you again. What reaction would there be from Syria's neighbours? Jonathan, would you start off? There's a strike. We don't know what form. This is what the evening is. It's discussing it. What would the reaction of the neighbours be?
Well, if it's a limited strike, which Obama seemed to be talking about at the beginning, there might actually be no reaction. I think there could be a lot of bluff we're hearing from Assad and other countries that support him, and there might actually be nothing. I mean, talking about Russia. If it was a really heavy strike that was clearly designed for regime change, a great sort of wave of stuff, and saying that with a bit more and more, then I think they would start reacting. And it would be Iran and Hezbollah who would be the main frontline reactors.
And if there was not a United Nations agreement, and our friend at the back raised this and so did you, if there was a unilateral Franco-American strike, would that produce retaliations of a different kind?
I think there were massive demonstrations throughout the Arab world. We'd see the Arab street coming out not only against their own dictators, but against the West for yet another intervention in their country. So we would lose. I mean, we, the West, would lose all support in the Arab street. We would only be left with a few Gulf monarchs on our side.
And the friend here who raised the point, if there were Arab League countries or if the Turks were involved...
Well, you raised a very good point. None of these Arab League leaders has dared to come out. Not one has come out publicly for military strikes against Syria, even though they've suspended Syria from the Arab League. They do not like him. They think he's an unworthy leader, but they do not come out in favor of military strikes because, as somebody said at the back, nobody in Syria, however hostile they are to Assad, really wants a military strike. Certainly not if they're living in the big cities like Damascus.
Nobody?
Well, not nobody. Yeah. Not nobody. I think somebody said nobody.
Scott,
I'm exaggerating.
Scott
they
Lucas.
were exaggerating.
With respect, Patty, I think there's a bit of skewing that's occurring now because of this idea that intervention means bombing. And intervention means the U.S. and the French deciding to intervene. The point here is I actually don't think the question should be on bombing. It should be on a longer-term question of intervention based on support for the insurgency. And that is because of this question about the neighbors. The Saudis favor such a strategy. In fact, they're in the lead on such a strategy, and if you decide not to intervene, they're going to continue to do so. Most of the Gulf states support the insurgency. The Qataris support it, the Omanis support it, the Kuwait...
of democracy. Okay, it's difficult to hear you without the mic, so he's saying champions of democracy.
Okay, let me just stop. I'm not talking about... We'll talk democracy later. I'm talking about what is. What is. Lebanon is facing, as you point out, my good friend, the question of refugees. What the Lebanese want is they want some type of solution, not 2 years, 5 years, 10 years from now. They want it soon.
Okay, is there intervention without intervention? I think that's what we're now asking, Shiraz. Is there a sort of Scott intervention where no one gets hurt and there's no missile? What kind of intervention is there without a cruise missile?
Well, intervention has been going on in this conflict from the earliest stages of the uprising. The Russians and the Iranians have been intervening from the get-go, providing the lifeline and the umbilical cord Assad needs.
So how do the neighbours stack up if the intervention changes its
neighbours?
style?
Okay, so the neighbours are divided. You have the Gulf states, particularly Saudi and Qatar, who are on the side of the rebels. And this is unfortunately part of the problem of not intervention. The opposition in Syria is a spectrum. You have to think of it like that. It is a spectrum. And on the one end, you do have the al-Qaeda aligned fighters who are very sectarian, who will take Syria out of the chip pan and into the fire without any doubt. But you have this huge element within the opposition that is secular, that is nationalist, who have no access and recourse right now to guns, to weaponry, to men, money and munitions.
And we're
they need that.
We're talking about the neighbours. What change in intervention tactics would influence the neighbours? You can answer it how you like, because Scott said there could be some kind of intervention which isn't military. What change would agitate the neighbours? What would make Iran change? What would make Russia change? What would make Saudi Arabia change? What kind of thing that the West could do?
I think the way they're all pretty much, to my mind, embedded and entrenched in their positions. What you have to do is undercut them from the equation. That would be by bolstering the moderate opposition that is on the ground. So you can't remove the Iranians and the Saudis and the Russians and the Qataris from the equation. You need to find a way of sucking the heat out of this by giving real power and position to the moderate, the so-called FSA that does exist to some extent on the ground, but it's become meaningless because it has no access to anything.
Well, I think the Russians made it clear that if any strike would take place, they're not going to fight against anyone in this war. Right. I don't think the Iranians are going to fight for Assad against the Americans. I don't think they will get themselves involved. Hezbollah, so far, we see that they are reluctant in making any statements or any clear-cut comments about this, so they don't want to get involved as well. But I think if we bet on the meetings that are going to take place in the coming 2 days in the G20, there might be a solution with the Russians if they don't want to involve and get the Assad out of the country. Otherwise, there seems to be no other solution but to get in.
No, it's okay.
It's okay. It's okay. It's
Well,
not
what's-
okay.
what's-
actually.
no, but what's the
It's
question?
really bad.
What's the question?
Okay. So our question is about the neighbours. No,
but I already answered that.
Yes. Okay. You're allowed a second go. It's
Oh,
not-
I
it's not
see.
like
I thought the first go was good
It's
enough.
not Assad's regime. So basically, to you in the room now, do you have fears about regionalising this crisis. 2 million people, the most number of refugees since Rwanda, have left. 4 million are displaced within Syria. You've got the fears of Turkish jets have been downed. Kerry said if there's a strong wind, nuclear chemical agents can blow into Israel. Is anyone in the room concerned about the neighbours more than the panel seem to be? Yes, to you on the end there. What would happen if intervention rattled the neighbours?
Well, I'm just curious about the Syrian Kurds and what their role in all this would be, and particularly with regard to Turkey.
That's a great question. Can you add anything of yourself? What's your own knowledge about this?
No.
No? Okay.
Ignorant.
so am I, but I'm just asking you.
That's a great question, because there isn't a single Kurdish opinion on this. There are some Kurds who support, as it were, a greater notion of Kurdistan and therefore ally with the Turkish PKK. They claim they're neutral, but you can say that they have sort of sided with Assad. There are other Kurdish groups, not just in the countryside, but in Aleppo itself, which have sided with the insurgency. Recently, however, because this conflict has gone on, there have been some Kurdish militias who have gone and fought the insurgency, or elements of the insurgency, because what's happened is that the north is now, large sections of it are beyond Assad's control. And the longer this goes on, you have spin-offs with fights between different groups which take place. That's why I come back to the notion of that the Turks have argued for, and they've argued since 2012, talking about a neighbor, for a no-fly zone, for a protected zone, precisely to avoid this type of complication, this type of situation.
The Turks have been extremely restrained, have they not? I mean, the Turks, they're a massive power in the region. They've had their own liveried jets shot down, and they've behaved with the most extraordinary restraint. Why aren't we involving the Turks instead of sitting in London? What? The Turkish from whom? The government has. Oh, all right, okay. Well, we won't start that one. That's another evening.
All right. The Turks, because everything links up, inside, outside. The Turks are in a peace process with their own PKK, with the Kurds. They don't want to unsettle that possibility by going too far into Syria. On the other hand, they have said that as part of a multilateral action, not unilateral, they would favor going in, establishing the protected zone, and then look to talks.
Jonathan, are you afraid of this style of intervention? The Turks, the UN approved something, we don't know what. Do you change your position now if it sounds like this?
Well, obviously, as I keep coming back to the point, if there's a UN Security Council mandate for military intervention, the Turks would be the front line, and they would be the base. Americans would use that if they wanted their no-fly zone, use the bases they've got at Incirlik and so on. But I mean, the point is, I do agree with Scott on the question of the Kurds. They are very divided, but they are very worried about Turkey. Turkey's relationship with the Kurds has not been very good, and so they're worried about Turkish influence coming in. On the other hand, Iraqi Kurdistan has been very worried. They kept the border closed for a lot of the time between Iraq and Syria. But when it did open recently, and something like 45,000 people, the biggest single wave of refugees came across just 2 or 3 weeks ago, much bigger than any other wave of Syrians. And people were asked, why have you done it? It was because they said it was Jabhat al-Nusra was doing it. It was the Islamists who've come in from outside, or with some Syrian help as well, Syrian Sunnis, who are terrorizing. They were fleeing not Assad's people, nor the Turkish army, but their own Jabhat al-Nusra. And so that comes back to the point we have to be really worried about, if Assad fell, who's going to take over in Syria?
So, on this same point, the idea that intervention could exasperate regional tensions, we've obviously heard a lot from Assad saying the region will be on fire and so on in terms of striking back against this. It's also worth looking at the regional consequences of the war just going on the way it is. No one's talking about Jordan right now. No one's mentioned this so far. Jordan is bankrupt. Jordan is bankrupt and is absorbing unprecedented numbers of refugees. Its fourth largest city is a refugee camp of Syrians. It cannot afford to sustain them.
Do you make the case that non-intervention is intervention now?
I'm saying the omission becomes so great that it becomes an act in itself.
Okay, following on that, first, my name is Lina Khatib and I run the program on Arab Reform and Democracy at Stanford University.
Welcome.
I wanted to mainly talk about Lebanon, but this also applies to Jordan. I think the consequences of not intervening are far greater for Lebanon and Jordan. Lebanon is already in a very critical situation because of the refugees, and that's not just because of the economic strain. It's also because we have a large number of Syrian men amongst those refugees sitting there unemployed, responsible for families. This is ripe ground for recruitment by all kinds of militant groups. Right now, as Scott said at the beginning, it's not the case that if the regime falls in Syria that we will immediately have insurgents taking over. However, if the situation is left without an end in the immediate future, this is where we are heading. More empowerment of Islamists, including recruitment of these men in Jordan as well as Lebanon.
Can you just take in some of the concerns of the audience? There's a friend at the back saying, why are we not talking more about negotiation? Jonathan's making the point, if you don't have UN backing for your intervention, it's a dangerous Iraq-style form of monkeying around. Do you accept intervention without a UN mandate? Are you saying you're so worried you have some kind of bilateral intervention?
It is going to be multilateral intervention,
No,
not bilateral.
It might not be.
Well, we've got Australia on board, Turkey, the United States. Yes. The United States, France, Qatar, and a number of possible other partners. It's not necessarily going to be bilateral, but that's besides the point.
No, it is the
legally,
point.
legally speaking,
do you back intervention which is not Jonathan Steele style UN mandated? Do you back the
legally
other version?
speaking, it is legal. So yes,
Right,
it's
the
not.
answer.
I mean,
That's
people have a misunderstanding. They think that the only legal international intervention is through the UN Security Council, and actually that is not true.
We'll come to you, panel, to wrap that up. I'm sorry to shout at you, but I'll come back to you. There's a gentleman with the microphone at the back, and then here. I'm just trying to get through. The lady says yes is the answer. To you with the microphone, then over here.
Okay, so I want. My name
Please
is David
use the
Stoughton.
microphone, however.
Sorry, my name is David Stoughton. I wanted to declare a personal interest here because this is why I'm interested in the neighbours. I have a daughter working in Beirut as a journalist, and clearly, one way or the other, it's been affecting Lebanon in a big way. So the question, I suppose, for me, in the simple personal framework is, which is going to make it worse? You know, is the strike going to make it worse? The strike going to make it worse? Or is allowing the already stoked up tensions inside Lebanon to turn into some kind of sectarian violence going to make it worse?
Are you proud of your daughter covering this and risking herself?
I'm very proud of my daughter, inevitably. I mean, it's just but, and here's just a general point I want to introduce. There is also a personal moral responsibility around this stuff to take decisions. I think there are decisions we're all avoiding taking about the use, for instance, of drones. We are going to have to make decisions about the use of robot soldiers in the future. Where do you personally draw the line? Britain backed the banning of, or it actually was instigated partly, the banning of chemical weapons. You know?
So the topic is crossing the red line. Do you think this is about what kind of world we want? Do you think the
Yes,
topic...
I think it is. I think at the end of the day, some of us, you know, somewhere we have to take a moral stand.
Okay.
And I think that's not been
addressed tonight. It hasn't. I'll come back to you. The microphone's over here, I believe.
Yeah, I'd back the lady from Stanford who said that not intervening is not doing nothing. Supposing we had 15 million, and that's the equivalent, refugees coming to this country, we wouldn't say, oh, we'll just wait for the UN or we'll wait for diplomacy, would we? So I think we haven't talked about the responsibility to protect, and I think we should, I don't see how we can just use legal means when every day those people's lives are deteriorating everywhere. I mean, in all those countries, as the gentleman said, people are very impoverished in a lot of those countries. And one thing I was just going to suggest is, couldn't something be done about making not just no-fly zones, but places where there could be safety for people in northern Syria, for instance, under some kind of protection?
Jonathan is the panellist who's arguing strongest against a quick intervention. Do you accept that non-intervention is intervention? You're basically morally...
No, non-intervention is much better,
No, but the lady's saying that people are dying at risk, great risk, because of non-intervention.
Well, I always say do no harm. Better to do nothing than to do harm. And I think, as we've been arguing, some of us anyway, intervention would make things worse because of all kinds of reasons which we can go back on.
Microphone here.
Oh, hello, yes, my name is Wasim, I'm just some guy. Just wanted to say I'm from Syria, I blog regularly, I've been following what's been going on regularly, I have a lot of contacts in Syria and a lot of personal interest in what's going on. I just wanted to say that I started off when this revolution began as someone who was very pro-resistance, pro-Hezbollah, pro-leftist, stop the war stuff. And because I was seeing what was going on daily, on a daily basis, I could see I'm going to call it the hypocrisy of a lot of my colleagues in this kind of leftist current or anti-imperialist current. But that's not the point. What I do want to say is that this whole discussion and running around in circles constantly, it's like when you're watching a three-year-long version of The Untouchables. You know the guy is a criminal. You know that you can't touch him legally because he's bought the judges, because he's got everything stacked up on his side. You need someone to go in there and do what's right. Sometimes, I mean, I studied law, and I remember a very clear thing, which is legality and morality are not the same thing, and we shouldn't confuse them. So thank you.
And what is right in this circumstance?
What is right is that someone needs to go there and take this person out or stop this regime from being able to do no harm.
Kill Assad.
I would support any means possible.
Right, to you with the microphone. We'll go around the room. Panel, can you just listen to the audience for a while? There's another gentleman in the middle there wants a question. If you could please speak, yes?
So the video that we saw at the start was...
Sorry.
That's okay. The video that we saw at the start was demonstrating a human catastrophe. And we've touched on the issue of legality, but really only touched on it. Aside from UN backing, another potential legal action under international law is the doctrine of humanitarian intervention, namely taking preventative measures that are necessary and proportionate to prevent a further humanitarian catastrophe. And I would like the panel, if possible, to comment on their views on that.
Good. And that panel, please do. And would you also wrap in other things you've heard from the floor, and then I'll come back to the floor. Scott, would you like to go first? There's something we haven't talked about, humanitarian intervention.
Yeah. So linking this question of humanitarian intervention and the neighbors in the region. And again, I don't think Syria is like Iraq, but I will simply say that I think the failure of the United Nations to be able to stop the Iraq War in 2003 raised serious questions about the organization. I would love, like Jonathan, to say that the UN could step up and play a role here, but the fact is, and everyone here knows it, stop please.
We'll come back to you, let him speak.
I'm sorry, I get distracted really easily, so, okay. And that is that we know when it goes to the Security Council, you can play out the next act, that there's going to be basically a veto by the Russians and possibly the Chinese, although they'll probably abstain. And then the question is, what do you do next? And that brings us to the question of the neighbors. I think humanitarian intervention is a doctrine that was corrupted by Tony Blair and by Iraq. It was misused. I think it needs to be used properly here. If you do not act, we are not just talking about Syria, although that is vital. We are talking about the fact that Lebanon, which a year ago was at least somewhat firewalled from what is happening, it's not just refugees now. You're talking about car bombs. My good friend from Tripoli will know about this because of what happened recently. It is becoming sectarian because of the spillover. Jordan faces the same risk. Other countries face this risk. I think you have to, in respect, I wouldn't go as far as killing Assad. We can debate that later. But I agree with the general point.
Do something.
Do something. Intervene with a case and realize it can't be through the UN Security Council.
I echo Scott's words, and that's the case inside Syria. If you just sit and wait, the conflict is continuing. Assad feels that he has a green light to do whatever he wants, and if there is no action today, many people on the ground feel that more massacres will take place. Probably chemical weapons will be used again, and more people. There will be more refugees and more people killed on a daily basis. But if something happened, at least you can push the two sides to a negotiating table and end this conflict. People are tired; they just want an end to this solution.
My argument from the get-go has been a humanitarian one. I think we could spend another several hours here discussing the UN and its many, many failures. The case for Syria is a moral one. It is a humanitarian one. Put all the legalistic hand-wringing aside, the navel-gazing aside. People are dying and have been dying. And you know, the ones in Syria who are dead, they're the lucky ones. Because you don't want to be picked up by the regime. That's for sure. You talk to anyone who's been released from the prisons of Assad, and most of them will tell you that they wish they had died instead of being captured.
But if you had replaced the word Assad with Saddam in 2002, 2001, you could have been making the same case as we heard made. That's what we were told before in the West, wasn't it? He's gassed his own people, don't be picked up by Saddam. Do you accept that there's an echo of what you say?
What I say to you is that the Syrian people shouldn't be paying with their lives for the mistakes of the Iraq War.
So we're fighting the Iraq War tonight in this discussion.
That is exactly what happened in our parliament. Labour and all these MPs that voted against were seeking to exculpate themselves for the crimes of Iraq and the failures of Iraq with the bodies of dead Syrians. That is what happened. Let me just say one quick thing before you move, which is Lin Khatib has written a fantastic book on Syria. And if you want to know the background to all of this, buy her book. It's great. It wasn't you? Oh, well.
Another Lina.
Well, go and buy her book then.
So, buy books. Buy books. I'm coming to you next. I'm coming to you. Jonathan, would you wrap? Would you wrap? Give the microphone to him. We'll keep it going. Jonathan, the
well,
legalities...
I mean, we're also suffering from not just from the Iraq war, but from the Libyan war. The UN Security Council did authorize a no-fly zone to protect civilians in Benghazi 2 years ago. What happened? The US cheated on Russia and turned it into a regime change with bombing Tripoli and all the rest of the country, knocking out virtually everything that Gaddafi had. And it was a cheat. And that is another reason why Russia is very concerned about not giving a green light to another UN Security Council mandate. If it's, you know, they're deceived. That's one point. The other point on humanitarian intervention, there's a hell of a lot of hypocrisy on this one. Of course, huge numbers of refugees need help. In Kuwait, in January, the UN came up with a huge appeal pledge. They asked people to give, I think it was something like $4.5 billion. I may be wrong, I can't remember the figure now. But anyway, it was 100% agreed by various countries, including Kuwait and so on, and Western countries, Japan, Saudi Arabia, blah, blah, would give the money. And the UN said this is absolutely fantastic because of the humanitarian catastrophe. But 3 months later, only about a third of that money had been given. Why aren't they giving the money they promised to help the refugees in these terrible camps?
And so I propose we move on in a moment to the West and a new isolationism. But let's keep it on Syria and its neighbours with the Hall. To you, you first. So I beg your pardon, you had the microphone first. You second, yes.
Hi, John Drake from AKE. Intervention is quite a short-term thing. I'm thinking, where do we actually want Syria to be in 10, 15 years' time?
Who's we?
The West, international community, people who are interested in the country. I think once we've identified where we want Syria to be realistically, then we can work out how to get there, if that involves intervention or not.
Where do you think we want it to be? Or you?
I don't think we know. I think that's why we've hesitated so long to do something about it.
And to you, would you like to answer that? You know, as a Syrian, Lina, you know, when we say where do we want Syria to do, is that part of the problem or part of the solution?
I think it's part of the problem because for many Syrians they have been frustrated with the West and with the world from day one because of their promises, of their support for their call for freedom. I mean, if you look and follow up on the civilian movements and the peaceful movement amongst the activists and opposition and even the known opposition to the regime inside Syria, there was a brilliant, creative movement even amongst the Islamists, not the extremist Islamists that we see later in the conflict, that they wanted to build a civil, democratic Syria that is coherent and open for everyone, but every attempt of that has been first crushed by the regime and later let down by the world.
Scott, could you tell our friend here what's the best option in the best timescale for peace in Syria, you know, or democracy in Syria? Is there anything anyone talks about that is a regime with Syrians voting normally? Is there anything like that?
Well, with respect to my friend, it's a well-intentioned question, but it's the wrong one. It's not where we want Syria to be in 10 or 15 years. It's where Syrians want Syria to be in 10 or 15 years. That's why just simply coming in and saying, you should have this type of democracy or you should do this. When you intervene, you don't intervene to bring a system into it. You open up a space. You open up a space for Syrians to make choices. And to give one example before moving on, to take Jonathan's point about Libya, and that's a good, well-intentioned point. The mandate did expand, not just because of the U.S. A lot of people expanded it. What it did is it opened up a space for a lot of Libyans, many of whom might be dead today, to actually have a space which is imperfect, which still has problems, but at least they can begin to decide to make choices about the future of their country.
If I could just speak up for this gentleman, you know, crossing the line is about, we said we didn't want chemical weapons as a world. So if they've been used, we have a responsibility. We've accepted our responsibility. He doesn't want it. He's saying, what's our ultimate hope for Syria? We're motivated by moral means to act. He doesn't want to. He says, what's our destination?
You support Syrians in what they want. You support Syrians in a movement to some type of resolution. You support Syrians in a move to the type of government that they want to create and negotiate. You support Syrians as they try to reject extremism.
No, I'm going to the audience and you can wrap up. Coming to you. Yes, yes, yes.
As an American who's done some studying of American history and foreign policy, I'm not convinced at all that U.S. foreign policy is driven by caring about human rights or civilians getting gassed. No, my own bias, as far as I can see it, is it's what's called national interest. And I think that's going to play such a massive role in how all this unfolds. Not at all determining, but it's just a massive factor. And so I want to ask the expert panelists, what is your sense, if we're willing to be quite cynical, of what U.S., quote, national interests might really want here? And I guess I say that in the backdrop of, say, if you look at the Iran-Iraq war, this thing went on for 8 years, and these two Middle Eastern powers beat the crap out of each other.
Okay.
And we're both left on the map. So you got my question.
Yeah.
What would you say are the cynical U.S. interests that might exist here?
So I'll take that when we move to the west. I'll take that first. But is there anyone wants to finish off on the Syria and the neighbours? You know, and yes, I'll come back to you. New questioners first. And with respect, you've had two, but I'm not going to forget you completely. New questioners first.
Thanks, sir. My name's Paul Chandler. I'm independent, and I'd just like to know to the panel what happens if there is an American strike when Hezbollah rockets start falling on Israel.
Right. Would that happen? Do any of the panel
Well, I think
agree?
that's guaranteed to happen, sir.
No. Israel's gone 3 times during this war already into Syria and bombed it. You've had saber rattling constantly from Assad. The last time the Israelis went in and bombed Damascus, it registered on the Richter scale. The extent of the explosion was so deep.
So you don't think
they've not reacted? This is all saber rattling.
Jonathan,
and the regime can't react.
Do you think there's a risk?
Well, if it's a so-called symbolic surgical strike, so-called surgical, no. But if it's the beginning of a war of regime change, which it seems to be threatening to become, then I think Hezbollah will react, yes.
So we're on Syria and its neighbours.
Before you leave the neighbours, I mean, we have a Middle Eastern correspondent of The Guardian here. I've worked in 6 human rights groups at the Affidavits for Vanunu in Israel. I've written a book, an 800-page book about the Arab Revolt. We're not actually discussing the seriousness of this issue. This is more serious than Afghanistan or Al-Qaeda or anything else. This is, there are the ingredients of World War III here. It's been said by many people on many sides. I mean, I don't want to be alarmist, but they're there. And Islam is in a state of transition. And there is the Arab Spring, there's the Cairo speech. We have a change of regime in Iran by democracy. We have a coup in Egypt. Libya is a mess. Syria is not just Syria. I mean, forgive my reaction to your emotive feelings about this. This is not just Syria. This is the way the whole Islamic world is going to play out in the future. Pakistan is a basket case. I mean, imagine an intervention. I mean, indeed, the Israelis have gone and taken out a Russian battery there. It hasn't had any effect at all. There are a lot more weapons than that. It would have to be massive. And imagine the Israelis doing a massive attack. I mean, if we did a massive attack, and I say we as an American, it would be blamed on the Israeli alliance. So how would that play in the Arab world? Imagine what that would be like. I mean, it's completely impossible to talk about intervention. There's only one issue in this, and that's to get the Russians on board. And I mean, I think the Security Council is where this is going to happen, and I think Putin has even made comments about bacteriological warfare. I mean, I thought it was rather sinister that you were showing what appeared to be napalm. I mean, a Vietnam generation president. That looked like a napalm attack. Where are the photographs of people getting VX nerve gas or sarin? I don't see any photographs of this stuff yet. And I don't want to defend the Russian position on this because, I mean, they're going to go for a long, long way denying that it was a chemical attack. But I think we do need the evidence, and I think the thing has to be done by discussion. And I think Ambassador Crocker has already, I mean, Ellen got up and left the room. She thought all these arguments have been heard before. Ambassador Crocker has made the point. I think Iran is a very important player in all of this. We have an opening with Iran, and we have to pursue that. This is a very long-term thing. I mean, an attack, getting emotional about it, this is more of the chaos in the Arab world.
So keep the microphone, and we'll take comments from around the room. Jonathan, this is close to your position. No, you can keep. He's got one.
Keep it. Well, I mean, to answer the American question over there, I'm afraid I have to say that I think US policy is to bleed Syria. They don't want either side to win. If Assad wins now, it would be a big defeat for US policy and humiliation and so on. If the other people win, they're not sure what they're going to be. Will they be Islamists? How strong will the Islamists be? Will they control the government? Will they not? Will they be even more hostile to Assad than anybody else in the region? So the status quo is the best policy for the US as they see it. I think it's disgusting, but that is the way they see it. They just want to bleed Syria, gets Assad out of the equation. He's no longer part of any axis of resistance. He's so busy trying to control his own country, and that would be considered a strategic improvement over the situation of 5 years ago from Washington's point of view.
And Scott Lucas, an argument made against intervention here because we're not considering the escalation. We're not talking about escalation as much as the moral imperative to intervene. Would you react to what you've heard?
Yeah, I react about escalation and a question about the U.S., linking the two together. This isn't about the U.S. I'm sorry. I mean, I've been arguing for years that the mistake we make is that we put the U.S. at the center of the position, for example, in the Arab world, and the U.S. is quite often to the side. I actually agree there are a lot of mistakes in U.S. foreign policy, and that this isn't because of interest. But on Jonathan's point, for example, remember the United States did not, they actually supported Assad, or at least did not turn against him, until the end of 2011. They didn't favor regime change at the start of this. We're talking about a lot of people who are involved who are not Americans in this situation. These questions about escalation that are coming in here. Look, I'm interested in what is there on the ground. And the fact of the matter is that when you start saying, well, it might be Hezbollah will launch rockets on Israel, or we might have like Shia versus Sunni conflict and so on, it muddies the waters and it distracts from the fundamental. Whether you want a political solution, and I respect those who continue to drive for it, or those who say that politics won't work and intervene, address what is happening within Syria. Stick with that and do not get distracted by anti-imperialist arguments which are not at the center of what we're talking about tonight.
If I may...
No, to you, coming to you in a minute. Do you in the green check? Have you got the mic here?
Yes, hi. With a view to the neighbours, slightly more aimed at the intervention thing, but in a world where interstate cyber warfare is going on constantly, why is no one discussing sort of massive aggressive attacks against the regime in that form?
Like a cyber attack on the regime?
Yeah, and I think it would probably keep most people happy in terms of the neighbours and wouldn't stir things up too much in that respect.
Is anyone talking about, have you heard about that? Anyone talking about that?
Well, Anonymous today, by coincidence, took out the Syrian Electronic Army, if that's a small bit. The problem is that we're still in the realms, basically, of theory more than practice with cyber warfare for a lot of practices. It just isn't a short-term option.
Okay, microphone back over here, and we'll move on to the West in just a second. Now, we've heard, from the floor, there's a lot of banding around of the intervention without considering World War III. I don't know if anyone else wants to pick that up. You can have the microphone back, and we'll move to the West. Are we seeing an anti-interventionist thing in the West?
Can I just quote, since the 21st of August, every time Messrs. Biden, Obama, and Kerry have commented on this issue, there's one sentence, if you go back on their actual speeches, there's one sentence that they've never missed out from their dialogue. It said, in every one of this, America has to act in order to protect its interests in the region. In every single one of their speeches, all of them. Now, let us not forget all the lamentation and the puppy eye Kerry going on the telly, saying that, we have to act to protect the children of Syria. That is all, bullshit. When was the last time that America protected the people in Sri Lanka when 70,000 people are massacred by the regime? What's the difference there?
Do you agree with our friend in the front about the risks of an escalation?
Obviously, what if one of these missiles hits one of the Russian bases in Syria? Where do we go then? I mean, what if the Navy base of Russians is hit by one of these missiles? Can anybody answer that question?
Okay,
what did the Russians do?
All right, to the panel then. Would you like to start?
I just wanted to talk about something with regards of how the Syrians on the ground see this imminent or possible attack by the Americans. I don't think anyone is fooled about the interest of the Americans. They know that they're not coming to help Syrians have their democracy and have their freedom. And I quote one novelist in Syria who wrote about this attack, and he lives in Damascus. He said, "Remember that invaders bring that dictators bring invaders, but invaders never bring freedom. But however, the reality on the ground is pushing Syrians to they have no other options. They know the Americans are coming for their own interests,
right,
but there is no other way to stop the bleeding of Syrians on a daily basis."
Okay, and so we'll just move on now, if you don't mind, to the question of the West. Is it a shift in the interest and willingness and ability to intervene? Is it a post-Iraq shadow? Is what we've seen in the West a lack of desire because we've been so poisoned, as David Cameron said it, the well has been poisoned by Iraq. Jonathan Steele, are we seeing a new isolationism?
In America? I don't think so, no. I think
in the UK?
In the UK. I think we're seeing the end of empire, and I'm glad that that's happened. And I'm glad that people who are trying to revive empire are not winning, and they're losing. They lost the vote in the House of Commons last week. And I think the same thing is happening on a more slow and more gradual, glacier-like pace in the United States. I think Americans do not want to be the empire anymore. They've been tired of it. They've lost so many of their own troops, and their money and all the rest of it's gone down the drain in Iraq and Afghanistan. They're beginning to say, why can't we leave this, stop intervening anywhere? That's not isolationism, that's joining the world. Sweden isn't intervening, India's not intervening. Most countries don't intervene. Why do you always have to be intervening just to show that you're an important power?
That brought us all to silence there. Coming back to the audience, the question is, are we seeing a declining shift in the West's willingness and ability to intervene? Do you think, Shiraz Maher, we are?
I think to an extent we are seeing the hangover of Iraq and to an extent Afghanistan as well. You are seeing, and look, and there is some positives to this. The question which has riled the gentleman, to which I said I don't regard the question of questioning whether chemical weapons are used in Syria as being a legitimate question anymore, is because at this level now, we're not talking about the same evidence that was used in Iraq, dodgy dossiers put together in back rooms with some grainy satellite pictures being taken to UN. It is very clear. Scott has been documenting this stuff for years in this conflict. It is there. Syria is perhaps the most documented conflict we've ever seen because of the level of citizen journalism coming out of that country. It is clear to even the layperson that something quite dramatic took place. Everyone in the room just saw that video. It is clear that something very dramatic took place. So we are right to demand a degree of evidence. We are right to demand that we know why we're getting involved. We are also right to say wars don't just have beginnings, they have a middle and an end. So what are we going to do in Syria? What is the narrative arc, for want of a better phrase, of this intervention going to be and going to look like? And what are the aims and the objectives? And how do we eventually disentangle ourselves from all of this? This is right, and I think this is part of the lesson. But unfortunately, this kind of anti-imperialist, hackneyed argument that we've been hearing for years and years and years, well, this is precisely, and this gentleman hit the nail absolutely on the head. So precisely the people who will go and mobilize outside Downing Street and say, don't intervene in Syria. And when I go and talk to them, they say, look, we're British. We have to exert influence on our government. That is an entirely reasonable thing to do. But then, why are these same demonstrators going to the embassy of the United States, but not going to the embassy of Russia or Iran? Those countries are intervening. You've made lots of comments about the disgracefulness of the United States and its foreign policy and the malignancy from time to time of its foreign policy. Tell me about Russia's foreign policy. Tell me about Iran in the world.
Well, do you want me to start with Russia or with Iran?
Either one. I'll give you the
Russia's
right.
foreign policy is basically to keep its neighbours from being a threat to it. It's a very defensive sense of we don't want to be encircled. And so they're very concerned about the Middle East. They're rather closer to it than the United States is. They're very concerned about Islamic fundamentalism because they've had issues in Chechnya. They're more worried about the Americans leaving Afghanistan
did look a lot like Homs,
than the
doesn't it?
Americans are, to be honest, quite honest. The Russians are quite worried about the Americans leaving Afghanistan because they think the Taliban are going to take over. So their foreign policy is very complicated, but it's not about intervening hundreds and thousands of miles
the take-home
from their
message,
territory.
Russian foreign policy is complicated, but the United States foreign policy is imperialist.
Well, when
is
did
it that simple?
Did Russia invade Iraq? Did Russia in this generation invade?
You were just talking about Afghanistan a second ago.
No.
Have you not?
30 years ago they
history didn't
invaded.
start on 9/11, I'm afraid to tell you.
They learned the lesson and became more of a normal country, having
But
failed
they
in
are
Afghanistan.
intervening in Syria, and the Iranians
No,
are
they're intervening in Syria, but you were talking about Russian foreign policy elsewhere. You were saying, what else are they
You've been
doing?
condemnatory of the United States consistently. What I'm saying
Well,
is,
let him
are we
answer.
to take away that the United States is a malignant power in the world, but Russia is benign?
No, of course I'm not saying that.
Right, okay. Scott, would you like to react to this argument that's been had? It's a sort of relativism.
No, In the context of empire versus anti-empire, or even in the sense of outside powers, you know, that ship done sailed. The fact is that the United States 10 years ago tried to establish itself as a dominant imperial power. It failed. Let me just figure where we are here. The US, Russia, Iran, Britain have all been shown to they can't basically change this situation. They can't alter it to their interest. If they come in, it has to be part of a multilateral initiative. And I go back to my point. It is Syrians themselves on the ground we start with, not with the West and whether or not it's stronger or weaker.
Coming to you, yes.
Jonathan and I were on Voice of Russia, so I'm trying to engage him again on this level. What's all this business about imperialism? We've got something new in the world. Why talk about imperialism? We've got Islam in transition. I mean, why doesn't Islam tell us how are they going to solve their problems? Are they incapable of solving their problems? If they start solving their problems, which of the countries in Islam do you respect?
Wait.
Where's the center of this argument?
Can I come straight back on that, Patty? Yeah. Look, I'm just going to make a basic point. When the Arab Spring started in Tunisia, that was Tunisians, and whether they were secular or religious, they were making a move to say, we want our space, we want our rights. That was not the West that was trying to do that. That was not the Russians doing it, the Iranians. When Egyptians in January, February 2011 did that, that was Egyptians doing it. The tragedy has been where we are now 2 years later. When people in Libya rose up against Gaddafi, that was Libyans doing it. That wasn't Western manipulation.
Okay.
Yes, why do you want American
Just coming to this gentleman, you with the microphone.
To bring it back to kind of the West or the cooling off in the West, I think that Libya demonstrates that there still is a willingness in the West to intervene on humanitarian grounds.
Is it dwindling, this willingness to...
Is it dwindling? No, I don't think it is. What I think is dwindling is I think people don't like being lied to, and I think the government, both the Obama administration and the British government, have been very dishonest in how they've presented this intervention, because they've said, again, that it's going to be clinical and quick and in and out. And actually, the reality is, when you look at all of the footage coming out of Syria, huge amounts of the weaponry being used by the Assad regime is improvised, DIY weaponry. You watch them fire large rockets that they've built there off the back of pickup trucks. Lots of the fighting is from militias, both on the side of Assad and against. And for that reason, any intervention is going to have to be a lot larger than simply hitting large military installations.
Do you accept Jonathan's point? I'm sorry to step on your toes, because this part of the discussion is about, is there a declining willingness in the West? Do you accept Jonathan's fundamental philosophical point? Why do we keep intervening? Do you see, what's the answer to you? Why does Britain keep intervening? What's the answer?
Because I think we do have, sorry, when you say Britain, do you mean public support for intervention, or do you mean...
You can define it as the government sending troops or missiles on behalf of the United Kingdom. Why does the government do that? Why did Tony Blair do it? Why did David Cameron try to do it? Why?
Well, there's a very complex set of reasons why. Certain numbers of them are based on kind of concepts of national interest and what they perceive to be in their national interest, and other reasons are that ministers have moral views and they think that it's right. But
and do you?
Do I think that it's right?
Sometimes.
I think that there are many humanitarian interventions that I would support, but I think we have to be very honest with ourselves about what intervention involves, and it will not be a quick process, and it will be a large process if we go ahead with it.
Sorry. By the way, my name is Dennis Marks.
Hello, Dennis.
Hello. I think that we're using the wrong language here. The word intervention, the word imperialist, what we're talking about is two wars going on. One of which is an internal, multi-sided civil war, and the other of which is a proxy war. And the proxy wars are not the ones we are addressing ourselves to, for the simple reason that the war that Russia and parts of the Gulf are fighting across the civil war in Syria with Western powers and Western allies and so on, can only be addressed by international means. And the parallel with this is Bosnia. That what we're looking at is something very similar to the third or fourth year of the war in Bosnia. And unless we have some way of addressing those proxy wars through the United Nations, no amount of intervention is going to make any difference, and more Syrians will die.
Right, but that was NATO, that wasn't the UN in Bosnia.
Indeed, because the UN, in the end, was incapable of resolving it.
So we're looking at Bosnia, but without the UN. So there wasn't the UN then either.
What we're looking at is why Bosnia broke down, and why it mustn't be allowed to break down in Syria in the same way.
Okay, round the room, and then some closing remarks.
Thank you, sir. Just what the gentleman said earlier about improvised weapons. I mean, if you watch YouTube now, actually the Syrian rebels are firing $15,000 a shot
advanced Soviet weaponry at the regime, and they're knocking tanks out from 3 kilometres, and that's jihadists and people like that. So Saudi Arabia and Qatar are pouring petrol onto this whole conflict as well. So we're talking about America. Let's talk about the Gulf states and their support of the jihadists and everything else as well.
Okay, I mean, I'm glad you're raising it. We did try and do neighbours earlier, but you're welcome to make the point. To you with the microphone, and then to the lady at the front and the gentleman next door.
Paddy, may I come back to the point earlier raised by the panel? Who can remove Assad regime or Assad personally and his family? May I suggest that the only country in the world who can do that effectively, efficiently, is Israel, like they did in Entebbe, in Uganda, and various other. So would the panel agree Israel going in and picking up the Assad family and handing over the gates, opening the gates of Damascus?
I think they're going
for
to say
the
no.
Jabhat al-Nusra?
I will ask them.
Well, this is what these people are asking.
All right, okay, yeah. I think the point is that, Jonathan, that it's not a facetious point. It's that if you pursue this to its logical end, where do you end up with demands for intervention? That's the point from the floor.
Well, I mean, I just have to repeat myself. I mean, intervention is so open-ended, you don't know what you're going to end up with, and it'll almost certainly be worse than where we're starting from now. I mean, when I first went to Syria after this crisis started a year or so ago, I'm grateful to Lina, who was fantastic in putting me in touch with a whole lot of activists who wanted, some of them were saying to me, there are 3 no's. No to sectarianism, no to militarization, no to foreign intervention. They didn't, when they said no to militarization, they didn't want even arming of the rebels. They still thought there was an opening for peaceful protest, mass protest, they thought might still have an option. Now, I'm not sure what some of those people are saying. Some of them may have moved towards supporting military intervention, but I'm sure some of them still stay where they are. There is a group called the National Coordination Body for Democratic Change, terrible acronym title, which is absolutely anti-Assad. Many of them have spent years in Assad's jails, who still continue to call for non-military diplomatic intervention, and I think they are right.
And to this lady in the front.
Yes, Ginko Kobayashi, originally from Japan, and journalist. I think that the question itself, whether the West's intervention power is declining or not, I think the question itself may be wrong, because what happened in Britain at the Parliament is that the people are more knowledgeable what's happening, and that people are not just people are not convinced that there will be some really better step toward peace if some limited military intervention is going to be done. So I think people are not stupid. I think there is I think this atmosphere of this room is a little bit different from the majority of people in the nation. And in America, I think people are not convinced, that's all.
Can I ask you, as a Japanese journalist, did you think the British changed their style of approach to these matters after what happened in Iraq?
You mean the people or the politicians?
The Parliament, if you like, the Parliament. You were mentioning the Parliament. Did the Parliament behave differently now because of what happened in Iraq?
Yes, but it's not because politicians are sort of weak people, because they couldn't just do it without the support of the people. That's what happened, I think.
Okay, to you.
Frank Jackson, World Disarmament Campaign. I'd like to start by going right back to the beginning. You don't bomb for peace. That was one of the lady at the back said. And that, I think, is absolutely true. The more killing you do, the more you promote more killing. So the first thing that is absolutely necessary is for every party concerned to try and work for a ceasefire. Everything else should be subsidiary to that. I know it's very, very difficult, but nevertheless, I think that must be the absolute priority for everybody. There's positive things that can be done. First of all, Jonathan mentioned the humanitarian aid, which was not delivered. An enormous increase in humanitarian aid to all the neighbouring countries which are taking the refugees would in itself be a helpful step forward. The Geneva conference that's supposed to be taking place, and yes, various people are not wanting to take part. I would suggest that it should be convened with whoever is at this moment prepared to take part in it. And if they wanted to say, no, we don't at this moment, maybe there'll be some small progress made. And United Nations, there is if the Security Council, of course, it isn't the United Nations that failed, it's the member nations of the of the UN, and in particular the 5 permanent members of the Security Council that have been the cause of most of the problems throughout the years since it was founded. So don't blame the UN, blame the but there is a mechanism. If the Security Council can't reach agreement, there is a mechanism for the General Assembly to take over called Uniting for Peace. And one very last point, next week there is a huge arms trade fair in Docklands in this country where, among other, I'm not sure whether they're actually going to be attending, but have been invited, is the Russian arms export organisation, which is the one that's been supplying Assad with its weapons. Right. Hypocrisy? Yes, I think that's the one key word on all parts.
Thank you very much, Frank. So finally, panel, there's been many disagreements and many people have introduced, some very worrying sentences tonight. Third World War, also talk of don't bomb for peace. Many passions raised. Can you take us back to the question that people came for? But briefly, are we crossing a red line? Whether you like it or not, panellists, is something about to change because of the situation in Syria, whether you like it or not? Jonathan?
Yes, we are. I mean, Obama is about to take military action unless the Congress and Senate next week vote no, and I think he will have to listen to that just as Cameron did. He is going to take military action, and that will undoubtedly change the whole situation.
Shiraz Maha?
I think in part of the discussion about intervention, we've become very fixated on this idea, and we've actually discussed it a lot, the idea of killing Assad, or what if Assad dies, and taking out the regime. The stated position of Western governments, as well as a lot of people on the ground, we're talking, again, what does everyone really want? There's always going to have to be a negotiation at some stage. And those of us who are talking about intervention, I think, I'll speak for myself, won't speak for my colleagues on the panel, but there's an acceptance here. I said it at the start, this has become a zero-sum game for Assad. And he's willing, and he's demonstrated his willingness to do whatever it takes to try and stay in power. So intervention needs, at this point, to be about upping the ante, to make it clear to him, you need to come to the negotiating table, and to do so in good faith. Right. Because at no stage has the regime come in good faith to negotiate an end to this. So that, if you think about intervention in those narrow terms, to make it clear to Assad, and more importantly than Assad, his inner circle, people who actually might have some future in a post-Assad Syria, that they need to come to the table in good faith.
Are we crossing the red line, Lina Sinjab?
I think we're crossing the red line in continuing to watch what's happening in Syria without doing anything. Personally, I would like to see using the threat of an intervention to push for a political solution without doing an intervention, and push Assad and the rebels to come to the negotiating table and end the suffering of the Syrian people. But sadly, it doesn't look like this is going to happen. I agree with Jonathan that many of the peace movement people now, they don't want an intervention, but they see it as a last resort because there are no other options. Otherwise, if nothing is happening now, the killing is going to continue. More people will be forced into refugees, and more people will be dying on a daily basis.
And Scott Lucas, are we seeing the crossing of a red line, or maybe the question is many red lines?
With respect, I don't want to start from there. I want to start from here. I think the question of bomb or no bomb is tangential. I think the question of U.S. and Western powers is tangential. Very briefly, I want to go back to where it started, when I started seeing it, which was in March 2011, when people started demonstrating and hitting the streets, Syrians peacefully demonstrating for their rights. Now, this conflict has gotten militarized, but I still go back to that. Those protests still occur. For example, in a place called Kafranbel in Idlib province. It took place last Friday. They had some protest. And then, over the next few days, the regime has been bombing Kafranbel, killing a number of people. I wish there was a political solution. I honestly do. And I respect everyone who said that tonight. I spent most of my life being against war, against military action. But when homes, or most of homes, was destroyed in February, March 2012. When Aleppo was a divided city in July 2012, and when chemical weapons were used as part of the attempt to clear out the Damascus suburbs last month, the political solution just is not there. Intervene, but not with bombs, with a sensible strategy on behalf of working with the insurgency.
Okay, well, thank you all very much indeed, and for trying to marshal your expertise and your views into 90 minutes. We all appreciate it. It's not easy to do. So on behalf of all of us in the room, we were listening to Jonathan Steele, Shiraz Maher, Scott Lucas and Lena Sinjab. And thank you very much to you for your patience this evening.